Hello. So, I'm reading the third chapter of The Big Question, and it's Theory, Evidence, and Proof. How do we know what is true? So, here we go. We all like things to be simple. As a teenager, I exulted in the simplicity of the natural sciences. They proved things, they offered certainties based on rigorous engagement with the evidence. I read Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy when I was about 16, particularly enjoying its anti religious polemic. Yet Russell irritated me at one point. He declared that one of the chief benefits of philosophy was to teach us how to live without certainty. This was ridiculous. Proven answers to the big questions of life. As far as I was concerned, faith, especially religious faith, was just about guesswork and hopeful thinking. I held to what I later realized was a simplistic scientific positivism from which faith was totally excluded by the evidence, a view later expressed so well by Richard Dawkins. Faith is a state of mind that leads people to believe something, it doesn't matter what, in the total absence of supporting evidence. If there were good supporting evidence, then faith would be superfluous. For the evidence would compel us to believe it anyway. You only believe what you can prove. That, as far as I was concerned, was that religion demanded disengagement from reality and an invented universe which bore no relation to what I knew through physics. Religion dealt with a fictional universe in which everything was made up. Science dealt with things that could be proved, that could be shown to be right. It was the most secure and reliable form of knowledge. Yet every now and then it was as if someone drew aside a curtain, revealing a glimpse of a darker and more complicated world, spoken of only in whispers by those who taught me science at school. It was as if they had sailed forbidden seas, to borrow a nice phrase from Herman Melville's Moby Dick, and did not want me to go there just yet. As my fellow students and I studied the nature of light in physics classes in the late 1960s, we were told that people once thought that light traveled through a medium called the ether. Of course, we were assured nobody believed that sort of nonsense anymore. I gained the impression that this was the sort of thing people believed way back in the Middle Ages. Then I realized that my teachers were talking about what scientists believed a mere 2 generations earlier. So why, I wondered, did science change its mind about so many things? If the evidence compelled us to believe something, surely that was the end of the matter. If something was proved to be true, how could you change your mind about it? The problem, of course, was that I was being taught a simplified and sanitized version of science, suitable for school kids, and nobody else. We were taught that science was about facts, an established body of knowledge, proved by experiments. It is an infantile view of science which is still found in low-grade popular works such as Christopher Hitchens' amusing New Atheist Manifesto, God is not great. But it is not real, hard science, I later came to discover. When I and my classmates at school were not told was that the progressive nature of the scientific project meant that what scientists believe today would change over time, sometimes being modified, sometimes being abandoned altogether. The same evidence might be interpreted in new ways, or new evidence might come to light which forced science to abandon existing ways of seeing things. That is why my reading in the field of the history and philosophy of science shook me to my foundations. I suddenly realized that things were much more complicated than I thought. Simplistic talk about compelling evidence is seriously misleading for a number of reasons. It suggests that evidence is a purely objective matter and fails to recognize its complicated subjective aspects. Human beings are creatures who exercise reflective freedom and are perfectly capable of forcing evidence into their preferred and predetermined modes of thinking. The Lincecum affair of the 1940s illustrates this well. The maverick biological ideas of Trofim D. Lysenko were seen as politically acceptable to the leaders of the Soviet Union, and the scientifically orthodox ideas of his opponents were denounced as bourgeois or fascist. As the sad history of evolutionary biology during the era of the Soviet Union makes clear, a groupthink can emerge which disregards evidence it considers inconvenient or which accommodates it, often through the application of intellectual violence within an ideological framework. Russell was right. We need to cope with uncertainty, and that is challenging both intellectually and existentially. Looking back on my days as a teenager, I cannot blame myself for longing for certainty. We all do it, in our own ways. We want to know where we stand. Maybe there are deep psychological forces at work within us that incline us to adopt this very naive model of science, even if we know its limits. This also helps us understand why religious and anti-religious fundamentalisms, which trade in certainties, are so attractive to some people. The real world outside these bubbles of spurious certainty is rather more challenging, yet we have to cope with it and live within it. The novelist Henry Miller once spoke of a journey of exploration which led not to a place but to a new way of looking at things. When confronted with a mass of observations, the scientist's fundamental instinct is to try to figure out what big picture or theory makes the most sense of them. One of the core themes of the natural sciences is that observations are of critical importance. Aristotle spoke of saving the phenomena, meaning that observational evidence had to be protected at all costs. A theory was to be judged against the evidence of observation, and if it did not fit the evidence, its validity could be called into question. There can be no question of filtering out observations that inconveniently do not fit with the theory. The scientific quest aims to find the best way of seeing things, the approach that makes most sense of what is actually observed, free from ideological pressures of any kind. What one generation firmly believed to be true may be rejected by a later generation as inadequate or simply wrong. Science is on a journey and has not yet reached its final destination. That means that things are in a flux. It is an unsettling thought, especially for those who like things nice and simple and, above all, stable. It is easy to see why some people prefer to think of science in terms of a fixed set of scientific results rather than as a method whose constant and consistent application leads to changing ideas over time. 100 years ago, just about everyone believed that the universe has been around forever. Now we believe it has a beginning, opening up some fascinating questions about where it came from in the first place and what its future will be. Neither of these beliefs is arbitrary. They both represent the outcome of reflection on the best evidence available at the time. But the evidence and the theories have changed and will continue to change. The astronomer Carl Sagan made this point elegantly and needs to be heard clearly. Science is much more than a body of knowledge, it is a way of thinking. This is central to its success. Science invites us to let the facts in, even when they don't conform to our preconceptions. It counsels us to carry alternative hypotheses in our heads and sees which ones may best match the facts. I like that humility. It stands in sharp contrast to those arrogant religious and anti-religious dogmatisms which seem to trade only in certainties. These dogmatic views of reality have no place for the tentativeness, open-mindedness, and above all, intellectual humility, which I now know to be characteristic of both science and religion at their best. These dogmatic people seem to think that one convolutive act of intellectual assertiveness allows them to escape the complexity that haunts humans' existence. It does not and it cannot. I used to, I used to think like that, but I don't anymore. Even theologians are aware of the need to embrace humility and avoid dogmatism when talking about God. As the 19th century Oxford theologian Charles Gore nicely put it, human language never can express adequately divine realities. A constant tendency to apologize for human speech, a great element of agnosticism, an awful sense of unfathomed depths beyond the little that is made known is always present to the mind of theologians who know what they are about in conceiving or expressing God. Let's follow through on Sagan's wise counsel to carry alternative hypotheses in our heads and see which ones best match the facts. How does that work out in practice? Some examples from the history of science will show us this process in action. Some of the best examples of this process of theoretical change and development comes from Sagan's own field of astronomy. In what follows, we will look at some of these and see how they help us make sense out of things. From the earliest of times, it was known that there were certain stars that seemed to move at different speeds against the background of the fixed stars. The Greeks called these planets, from the Greek word for wandering. So what was special about them? In the 2nd century, the Greek astronomer Ptolemy set out a way of understanding the heavenly bodies which would be accepted by most people for more than 1,000 years. Ptolemy argued that the sun, moon, and planets all revolved in circular orbits around the Earth but at different distances. It was a neat model and it worked reasonably well, partially because before the invention of the telescope in the 16th century, observations of planetary movements were not very accurate. Yet by the dawn of the 16th century, it was clear that the geocentric way of looking at things was not good enough. It was therefore modified so that the observations would fit in with the theory. Early medieval astronomers argued that planets moved in more complex ways than people had thought. In effect, in circles within circles, usually referred to as epicycles. By the late Middle Ages, these epicycles had become very complex. What had once seemed a very elegant and simple model was beginning to look forced and unnatural. But what were the alternative ways of seeing things? In 1543, a new way of seeing things was proposed. The Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus published a book arguing that the sun, not the earth, stood at the center of things. The earth and the planets rotated in circular orbits around the sun, only the moon revolved around the earth. This heliocentric, sun-centered view of the solar system caused some controversy. People were so used to thinking of the sun rotating around the earth, they found this new way of thinking unsettling and disturbing. Surely the Bible taught otherwise. Did Psalm 119:90 not declare that God had established the earth and it stands still? How did this fit in with Copernicus's radical new idea that the earth moved? Yet it was soon realized that this was not quite what the text meant. A better translation was easily proposed. God had established the earth and it stands firm. Not everyone liked this new way of seeing things. The real opposition to Copernicus's came from other scientists, not as is often suggested from religious people. There were two major problems with Copernicus's theory. First, it did not account for planetary movements with much greater accuracy than Ptolemy's model. The reason for this was simple. Copernicus wrongly assumed that the planets moved in perfect circles around the sun. We now know that they move in ellipses, somewhat flattened circles, with the sun slightly displaced from their centers. This insight arose decades later as a result of Johannes Kepler's close study of the movement of the planet Mars in the early 17th century. Second, if Copernicus's theory was right, it meant that the appearance of the fixed stars should change over a period of a year. As the Earth moved through space, the relative positions of the fixed stars would be expected to change. This was investigated by the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe, who found no evidence of this parallax effect. We now know the reason for Brahe's failure to observe this effect. The stars are much farther from the sun than anyone realized at the time, and the very small parallax effect, invisible to the naked eye, was only observed as a result of improvements in telescope design in the early 19th century. Brahe concluded that the evidence thus pointed to the sun revolving around the earth rather than the other way around. We need to realize that Brahe's interpretation of the observational evidence was actually right on the basis of the evidence available to him at the time. Now, while this brief excursus into early modern astronomy is interesting in its own right, it allows us to appreciate 3 points of critical importance to any proper understanding of scientific theorizing. These 3 points could be made by looking at other episodes in the history of science. I have chosen these case studies simply because they are accessible and easy to understand. 1. Science tries to find the theoretical model that provides the best fit for the observations. There is always going to be a debate about which theory is best. For a start, evidence builds up over time, and second, there is always going to be subsidiary debate about what criteria are used to evaluate theories. For example, do we choose the simplest theory or the most beautiful? Yet these difficulties do not in any way detract from science's pursuit of the best way of making sense of the universe. Very often, scientists find themselves believing for good reasons that a certain theory is right, but they are unable to prove it. In fact, they realize that they may never be able to prove that it is right. Yet they rightly continue to believe it is true, knowing that a good theory can be trusted until the evidence demands that they abandon it for something that is demonstrably better. 2. This means that scientific theories are provisional. They cannot be proved as if they were mathematical theorems. At any moment in time, the scientific community will believe that one way of looking at things is, on balance, the best. Yet scientists know perfectly well that their successors in the near or distant future may well look back on them and say, well, that's what they used to think back then. We know better now. And the scientific journey proceeds. Some ways of thinking are left behind. The best theories, however, are never completely lost, but are usually incorporated into better theories. Think, for example, of the way Einstein's theory of relativity provides a framework for Newton's three laws of motions, accounting for their successes and also explaining their limits. Most theories have to cope with anomalies, that is, observational evidence that does not quite fit the theory. A very naive scientist might suggest that this is enough to abandon the theory, but science is wiser than that. It knows that things are rarely that simple. The theory may be right, yet need modification at minor points. Think of Kepler showing that Copernicus was right about his major belief that the sun was at the center of the planetary system, but wrong about his minor belief about the circular shape of the planet's orbit around the sun. Or it may be that something we believed to be a major problem for the theory was later shown to be less important than was thought, or rested on a misunderstanding. Think of Tycho Brahe's worry about stellar parallax. Most readers will see that there are important parallels with religious faith at every point. We will be returning to the first 2 points again and again in this work. But what of the third? What of situations in religious faith where something does not always seem to fit the theory? In the Middle Ages, theologians wrestled with the question of the eternity of the world. The science of their day told them that the universe had always been there. Their faith taught them that it had come into being. There was a clear anomaly here, and they found a way of coping with it, in effect by agreeing to live with a divergence which could not be resolved on the basis of the scientific methods available at the time. In the end, science abandoned the notion of the eternity of the universe, adopting an approach which is not identical with the religious idea of creation, but is clearly consistent with it. Religion has to cope with anomalies as well. In the case of Christianity, I would see the existence of suffering as, at least on the face of it, being such an anomaly. But as Christians, writers down the ages have argued, there are ways of understanding suffering that lessen the intellectual burden of this problem and enable us to cope with it in our everyday lives. While there is more to be said about this, we need to move on and think more about the place of evidence and proof in science and some of the questions raised by these themes. Does science prove its theories? The popular stereotype, which I used to believe myself, is that scientists are hyper-rational people who only accept what can be proved on the basis of evidence. As with all stereotypes, there is some truth in this. Science is about the quest for the best explanation of observations, yet it is often hard to prove that one given theory is the best, partially because nobody entirely agrees on what criteria to use. Simplicity, elegance, comprehensiveness, fruitfulness, but the basic point is clear. Science trades in warranted beliefs on the basis of a public debate about the best interpretation of publicly available evidence. At this point, a philosopher might raise an objection to our loose way of speaking about science and proof, and point out that in its rigorous sense, proof applies only to logic and mathematics. We can prove that 2 plus 2 equals 4 just as we can prove that the whole is greater than the part. It is a fair point. Yet it is still reasonable to say that science provides us with excellent grounds for believing that certain things are true, such as that the chemical formula for water is H2O, or that the average distance of the moon from the Earth is about 238,900 miles. Let's recall Dawkins' view about evidence of faith. Noted earlier, if there were good supporting evidence, then faith would be superfluous, for the evidence would compel us to believe it anyway. I have no hesitation in saying that the evidence compels me to believe the chemical formula for water is H2O, or that the moon is on average about 238,900 miles from the Earth. But Dawkins fails to make the critically important distinction between the total absence of supporting evidence and the absence of totally supporting evidence. Evidence, as every working scientist knows, can be ambivalent, pointing in several directions, open to several interpretations. A good example lies in the current debate within cosmology over whether the Big Bang gave rise to a single universe or a series of universes, the so-called multiverse. I have some distinguished scientific colleagues who support the former and some equally distinguished scientific colleagues who support the latter. Both are real options for thinking and informed scientists who make their decisions on the basis of their judgments of how best to interpret the evidence and believe, but cannot prove that their interpretation is correct. There is nothing new about this kind of dilemma. It is hardwired into the scientific enterprise. Charles Darwin was faced with a similar problem in developing his theory on natural selection. The evidence was just not good enough to clinch it. In fact, there were several major problems with his theory, including his failure to explain how changes were passed from parents to offspring. Furthermore, everything that was known about the natural world could be accommodated by rival evolutionary theories such as transformism. We have all read simplistic accounts of how Darwin triumphantly proved his theory, but it is more important to read Darwin himself, who was absolutely clear that he felt he could trust his theory despite his evidential weaknesses. Darwin believed that his theory was right and that it would one day be shown to be right. After all, he pointed out, how could a theory be wrong when it made so much sense of what he observed? Yes, there is loose ends everywhere and a large number of problems, but his core idea seemed to him to be correct, despite the fact that it could not be proved. A crowd of difficulties will have occurred to the reader. Some of them are so grave that to this day I can never reflect on them without being staggered, but to the best of my judgment, the greater number are only apparent, and those that are real are not, I think, fatal to my theory. Now, there is no way that this recognition of anomalies and difficulties need lead us into some kind of free-floating relativism which allows us to believe whatever we like. It is simply a realistic and principled recognition of the ambiguity of our observations and experience. That is why the standard scientific textbooks rarely emphasize that science rests on faith. We believe that certain theories are true and have good reasons for thinking so, but cannot prove that they are true. A failure to recognize that faith is integral to the scientific method ultimately rests on the obstinate refusal to accept the ambiguity of evidence and the inescapable secularity of human experience and interpretation. Science is on a journey seeking the best way of explaining and representing reality. Science is primarily about a method and is secondarily about the outcomes of the application of that method. What one generation regards as secure and reliable may be abandoned by the next. Scientific theories are provisional. That does not mean that they are arbitrary. It just means that they are not, and can never be, the last word on anything. Richard Dawkins rightly points out that Darwinism is just as provisional as any other scientific theory. We must acknowledge the possibility that new facts may come to light which will force our successors of the 21st century to abandon Darwinism or modify it beyond recognition. I see now that Bertrand Russell was right. We need to learn how to live without certainty and yet without being paralyzed by hesitation. That is why Michael Polanyi's book Personal Knowledge is so important to reflective scientists. It sparked off a long overdue discussion about the limits of certainty in science and how scientists ought to respond to this issue. Polanyi was a Hungarian chemist turned philosopher who found himself increasingly troubled by his need to commit himself to what he believed scientifically to be true while knowing that some of this would later be shown to be false. He argued for the need to speak of science as personal knowledge, not absolutely certain yet still capable of eliciting justified belief. In many ways, Polanyi's work illuminates the frail condition of humanity as much as the nature of science. Scientific knowledge is not generated infallibly by a mechanical process, but involves our personal and fallible judgment that certain beliefs are reliable and to be trusted. Polanyi insisted that we must understand that commitment to beliefs, scientific or otherwise, inevitably transcends the evidence underlying them, and every now and then evidence emerges that something which scientists believe to be true really is true. The Higgs boson is a good example. Boson. On July 4th, 2012, there was a great excitement among the physicists huddled around the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, Switzerland. The Higgs boson has been seen, or at least they thought might seen it, or something very like it. On March 14th, 2013, Physicists at CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, confirmed the discovery. So what was all the fuss about? The Higgs boson is the mysterious particle proposed by physicist Peter Higgs and others back in the 1960s to explain the origin of mass. If its existence could be confirmed, another piece of the jigsaw puzzle of our understanding of the universe would have fallen into place. The media were fascinated. Not because of the science, though. Most newspapers have discovered that the reading public does not pay all that much attention to science. It does not sell papers. The reason for the huge media internet lies in the nickname given to the Higgs boson back in 1994 by the Nobel laureate Leon Lederman, the God particle. Journalists loved the nickname. Most scientists hated it, considering it misleading and simplistic. Maybe so, but it certainly got people talking about physics, and maybe it is not such a bad nickname after all. Letterman got people to invented the name the God particle because the Higgs boson was so central to the state of physics today, so crucial to understanding of the structure of matter, yet so elusive. Now, some people believe that science is about what can be proved, yet to say it again, it is just not that simple. Science often proposes the existence of invisible and often detectable things such as dark matter to explain what can be seen. Dark matter is something that is hypothesized by astronomers to account for gravitational effects that appear to be the result of invisible mass. The reason why the Higgs boson is taken so seriously by particle physicists is that it makes so much sense of scientific observations that its existence seems assured. In other words, its power to explain is seen as an indicator of its truth. There is an obvious and important parallel with the way religious believers think about God. While some demand proof that God exists, most rightly see this as unrealistic. Failing to appreciate and share the limits of human reasoning or the nature of God, believers argue that the existence of God gives the best framework for making sense of the world. God is like a lens which brings things into clearer focus. There is more to God than making sense of things. But for religious believers, it is a great start. The Higgs boson certainly helps us understand how the universe works. Yet it does not answer the rather more interesting question of why there is a universe in which particle physicists or particle physics can be done in the first place. We have spent quite a long time thinking about the role of theories within science, so what about religious theories? What do they do? And are there any parallels within scientific theories? The whole issue of making sense of reality is deeply embedded within both the natural sciences and many forms of religious faith, especially Christianity. In fact, one major factor that led me decisively away from my youthful atheism to Christianity was my growing realization that the Christian faith made far more sense of what I saw around me and experienced within me than its atheist alternatives. In what way, then, does religious faith work? What does it do? Scholars give lots of answers to this question, but I am just going to mention the ways in which it works for me. I will put them in the order in which I personally value them and leave readers to rearrange or add to this list as they think appropriate. Religious faith helps me make sense of the world by giving me a way of seeing reality which affirms both its intelligibility and coherence. It gives me a framework which allows me to discern meaning and purpose within life. Faith generates a moral vision that is not of my own making and does not serve my own interests. Faith helps me cope with negative situations by allowing me to see them in a new light. Faith brings hope by enabling me to see my life in a wider context of meaning. Hope here does not mean a groundless optimism, but a firm conviction of present significance and future fulfillment. We will explore these themes later, especially in chapters 7 and 8, but our concern in this section is to ask what reasons might be given for suggesting that a theory of things is to be trusted in the first place. We need to make a distinction here between a logic of discovery and a logic of justification. As the American philosopher Charles Peirce, himself a scientist, pointed out, some of the best scientific theories were developed by great imaginative leaps rather than by ruthlessly logical analysis. Both imagination and reason play a critical role in theory development, yet no matter how it was developed, a theory still has to be rigorously checked out against observation and evidence. A classic example is Auguste Kluge's theory of the structure of benenes, an organic chemical which did not behave in the way that its simple chemical formula H6H6 suggested, people came to think that the answer had to lie in its physical structure. Kluge realized that if benzenine was thought of as consisting of a core ring of 6 carbon atoms, many of its otherwise puzzling properties could be explained. He set out his proposal for the silical structure of benzenine in a French article in 1865 and again in a German article in 1866. Slowly, the idea found general acceptance. But how did Kluge come up with this idea in the first place? He did not explain the logic of discovery that led him to this innovative idea, although he provided an intensive logic of justification for the ring structure of benzenine. He was able to show that its chemical behavior was accounted for by this new model of its structure, far more successful than any of the alternative models then available. Kluge finally explained how he thought up the idea of a ring structure in 1890 at a celebration marking the 25th anniversary of his new model, by then widely accepted and highly acclaimed. Kluge told his astonished audience that he had a dream of a snake chasing its own tail and saw how this might be applied to benzenine. The audience might have been more astonished if they had known the deep sexual symbolism that Sigmund Freud later attributed to this image. But while the origin of this idea was frankly a little weird, the fact remains that when it was checked out against the evidence, it seemed to work. The manner of its derivation might seem strange. The manner of its verification, however, was perfectly clear and ultimately persuasive. So what actually happened as I made this transition from atheism to Christianity back in 1971? At one level, I began to see things in a new way. I had viewed what I observed around me and experienced within me through an atheist lens, realizing that this did not work as well as I had expected. I tried looking at it through a theist's lens and found that it gave me far greater clarity and sharpness of focus than atheism. This certainly did not prove that there was a God, but it made me realize that I needed to rethink things. Maybe belief in God made a lot more sense than I had thought, and that it is the line of thought that eventually led me to faith. Christians talk a lot about repentance, and often gloss this as saying sorry to God. I am sure that is part of the meaning of the idea, but there's not a lot more to it than that. The Greek word metanoia is much richer, meaning something like a radical change of mind or a fundamental intellectual reorientation. Many Christian Bibles miss the full meaning of this important word when they translate it as repent. A much better translation of the word metanoia would emphasize the idea of a mental transformation, a change of mind, and change of heart, which includes turning away from older habits of thought and action and embracing a new way of thinking and living. Paul wrote to the Christian church in Rome explaining that coming to faith is not about being conformed to this world, but being transformed by the renewing of your minds. Romans 12:2. That transformation demands alertness to the limits of human reason and openness to the greatness of God. Kathleen Norris put this well. Repentance means not primarily a sense of regret, but a renunciation of narrow and sectarian human views which are not large enough for God's mystery. That is what happened to me. I experienced a new way of seeing things, as if I had been given a new mental map. Later I read N.R. Hansen's works on the history and philosophy of science, in which he emphasized that observation was shaped by theoretical presuppositions. The process of looking at nature is actually theory Latin, in that what we see is often shaped by assumptions drawn from our culture or existing scientific theories. Theories are like a pair of spectacles, they affect what we see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. I was drawn to faith by its ability to explain things, to provide a big picture which wove together the threads of experience to disclose a pattern. I later discovered that both the celebrated journalist G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis returned to faith for a very similar reason. Let's look at what drew them back to faith in more detail. After a period of agnosticism, Chesterton returned to Christianity because of his discovery that it offered an intelligible picture of the world. Chesterton realized that testing a theory meant checking it out against observation. How well did theory fit observation? The best way to see it, if a coat fits a man, is not to measure both of them, but to try it on. For Chesterton, what really mattered was the comprehensive ability to faith to disclose a picture capable of embracing everything. Numbers of us have returned to this belief, and we've returned to it not because of this argument or that argument, but because the theory, when it is adopted, works out everywhere, because the coat, when it is tried on, fits in every crease. You put on the theory like a magic hat, and theory becomes translucent like a house of glass. Now, Chesterton overstates things here. Does the code really fit in every crease? Surely not. No worldview is able to accommodate the totality of human experience of the world. There will always be parts of the mental landscape that are shrouded in mist, even in permanent darkness. As a Christian, I find that the existence of pain and suffering does not fit easily in every crease of the code of faith. Like most people, I am suspicious of two neat theories. Yet I believe that Chesterton is right in holding that this coat seems to fit better than other coats, such as atheism. Chesterton argues that Christianity is to be judged not on the basis of individual arguments or considerations, but on the way of seeing things that is their overall outcome. The plausibility of Christianity does not depend upon a single argument or affirmation, but is rooted in an interlocking network of ideas and themes. Christianity is like a web of interconnected beliefs and claims, not something that is totally dependent on a single evidential foundation. Some nodes in the web we may be of greater importance than others, yet it is the overall coherence of this view that the world that Chesterton sees as being so compelling. It is a point that was later made by Harvard philosopher of science W.V.O. Queen, when some argued for truths that were analytic, that is, true by definition or as a matter of their internal consistency, and others for truths that were synthetic, true on account of some contingent fact about the world. Queen argued instead that all our beliefs are linked in an interconnected web which relates to sensory experience and its boundaries. The beliefs are not individual nodes of that web, but the web as a whole. Queen thus concluded that the unit of empirical significance is the whole of science. The only valid test of a belief, Queen argued, is whether it fits into a web of connected beliefs that accords with our experience on the whole. It is thus the Christian vision of reality as a whole rather than of its individual components that proves so intellectually and imaginatively winsome. Individual observations of nature do not prove Christianity to be true. Rather, Christianity validates itself by its ability to make sense of those observations. The phenomenon does not prove religion, but religion explains the phenomenon. For Chesterton, a good theory, whether scientific or religious, is to be judged by the amount of illumination it offers and its capacity to accommodate what we see in the world around us and experience within us. With this idea once inside our heads, a million things become transparent as if a lamp were lit behind them. And what about C.S. Lewis, who was an atheist as a young man? Lewis's initial commitment to atheism was grounded in his belief that it was right, a wholesome severity, even though he conceded that it offered a rather grim and meaningless view of life. He consoled himself by arguing that atheism's intellectual rectitude trumped its emotional and existential inadequacy. Yet Lewis gradually began to become disenchanted with atheism. For a start, it was imaginatively uninteresting. Lewis began to realize that atheism did not and could not satisfy the deepest longings of his heart or his intuition that there was more to life than what was seen on the surface. Lewis put it this way: in a famous passage from his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, describing the tension he experienced between his reason and imagination. On the one side, a many islanded sea of poetry and myth; on the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved I believed to be imaginary; nearly all that I believed to be real I thought grim and meaningless. Lewis's glib and shallow rationalism dismissed the deep questions of life, offering only superficial responses. We can prove shallow, superficial, and unimportant things, but the things that really matter, the truths by which we live, whether they are political, moral, or religious, simply cannot be proven in this way. Lewis came to rediscover Christianity mainly because of his realization that it made imaginative and rational sense, offering a coherent account of the patterns of history, the subjective experience of individuals, and the successes of the natural sciences. In an autobiographical memoir of 1930, Lewis remarked that he was an empirical theist who came to faith by God by induction. In induction, of course, lies at the heart of the natural sciences. So, what does Lewis mean by this? His fundamental point is that a theory is judged by its ability to fit in with our observations and experiences most elegantly, most simply, most comprehensively, and most fruitfully. Christianity gave him a lens that brought them into focus, a source of illumination that allowed him to see more clearly than he otherwise might. That is the point Lewis makes in his engaging and appealing statement of faith, now inscribed on his memorial stone in Poets' Corner, Westminster Abbey. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Some readers will protest at this point. It's all very well in saying that the God theory makes sense of things. But what is the evidence that the God theory is right in the first place? Are religious theories just made up? So what we see a universe that we have invented, a fictitious cosmos that bears no relation to reality? Or are they also attempts to make sense of our world? It is a fair question. Let's look at one of the theories dominant in both physics and cosmology at the moment. M theory. This theory was put forth by the physicist Edward Witten in 1995 as a means of unifying a number of different string theories, which hold that matter is made up of infinitesimally small strings of vibrating energy. That it has come to be widely accepted within the scientific community and underlies the recent work of Stephen Hawking and others. What is its appeal? In the end, the answer is this: it is a promissory note which shows signs of being able to unify observations and bring us closer to a grand unified theory. Yet many scientists remain deeply skeptical of the theory. Yes, they concede it provides a useful way of looking at things, but what is the actual evidence for this theory other than its capacity to explain? And how can it be tested empirically? To its critics, M theory seems to have acquired public respect and credulity in advance of any empirical experimental confirmation. It is, they argue, an unprovable theory that talks of invisible parallel universes in 10-dimensional space. Peter Woit, a professor of mathematics at Columbia University, is one of the more aggressive critics of M theory, arguing that superstring theory has had absolutely zero connection with experiment since it makes absolutely no predictions. What sort of theory is scientifically untestable? Other physicists. Here we go. Um, Other physicists disagree with Voigt, often strongly, holding that its explanatory potential mitigates its inability to be verified experimentally. I have no intention of commenting on this debate other than noting that it is taking place and relevant to our discussion. My point is simple. M theory is seen by many scientists as a perfectly reasonable way of seeing things, which achieves the pleasing, though far from total degree of holding together what might otherwise be disparate and disconnected aspects of physics. Its virtues are significant. They affirm the intelligibility and coherence of reality. by providing a way of seeing things that makes sense of our observations and holds together, or at least opens the way to holding together quantum theory and gravity. Yet there is no experimental evidence for the truth of the theory. It is trusted precisely because it offers an intelligible and coherent account of reality. Now, there is an obvious parallel with Lewis here. Lewis affirmed the intellectual legitimacy of adopting a theory, God, on account of its capacity to unify and explain. Even though the theory itself cannot be proved, although Lewis clearly believed that this belief was warranted by the evidence, during the 1920s, Lewis began to realize that he had allowed himself to be trapped inside some kind of rationalist cage, limiting reality to what reason could prove. Yet reason could not prove its own trustworthiness. Why not? Because we would then be using reason to judge reason. Human reason would both be judge and jury in an act of intellectual circularity. Unless the measuring rod is independent of the things measured, we cannot do measuring. But what is there? But what if there was something beyond the scope of human reason? And what if the world was full of clues to the meaning of the universe? Gradually, Lewis came to realize that these hints and clues pointed to a world beyond the frontiers of reason. We may hear snatches of its music in the quiet moments of life, or we may sense its fragrance wafted toward us by a gentle breeze on a cool evening. And if these clues did indeed point to the existence of God, this would provide an intellectual framework that made sense of things. There is, of course, more to Christianity than making sense of things. It is far more than a cerebral faith, as if it were some form of rationalism with a spiritual veneer. As I grew in my understanding of the Christian faith, I gradually came to appreciate the rich experience of beauty and awe which is so often evoked in Christian worship and which underlies its engagement with the natural world. Yet the intellectual capacious of faith cannot be overlooked, especially its discernment of a deeper structure to the world, which helps us grasp our own position within it and live out our lives more authentically. As the Harvard psychologist William James suggested many years ago, religious faith is basically faith in the existence of an unseen order of some kind in which the riddles of the natural order may be found and explained. Not everyone agrees that the virtues of the Christian faith include its ability to make sense of things. The literary critic and cultural commentator Terry Eagleton was severely critical of those who treat religion as a fundamentally explanatory phenomenon. Christianity was never meant to be an explanation of anything in the first place, he wrote. It's rather like saying that thanks to the electric toaster, we can forget about Chekhov. Eagleton suggests that believing in religion is a botched attempt to explain the world. It is about as helpful as seeing ballet as a botched attempt to run for a bus. Now, Eagleton is surely right to argue that there is more to Christianity than the attempt to make sense of things. Yet this explanatory theme is, as the novelist Dorothy L. Sayers came to appreciate, part of its rich heritage. Christians have always held that their faith made sense in itself and makes sense of the enigmas and riddles of our experience. The gospel is like an illuminating radiance that lights up the landscape of reality, allowing us to see things as they really are. The French philosopher Simone Weil made this point especially well. If I light an electric torch at night out of doors, I don't judge its power by looking at the bulb, but by seeing how many objects it lights up. The brightness of a source of light is appreciated by the illumination it projects upon non-luminous objects. The value of a religious, or more generally a spiritual way of life, is appreciated by the amount of illumination thrown upon the things of this world. The ability to illuminate reality is an important measure of the reliability of a theory and the indicator of its truth. This concern for the illumination of reality naturally leads us to reflect on a statement that the leading British biologist Sir Peter Medawar made towards the end of his life. Only humans find their way by a light that illuminates more than the patch of ground they stand on. It is a striking assertion which invites us to ask, what is the best light to illuminate our patch of ground? My narrative of enrichment suggests that both science and faith, when at their best, help us to make sense of who we are, why we are here, and what we ought to do. We need that rich vision to enable us to live our lives to the full. And that is chapter 3. Chapter 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. So yeah. It's really interesting about reading this book since I started. It makes me think of a few things. It makes me think of the and I don't. I think I've. Yeah, I think it's been touched before in the book. But the argument that people make between religious people and scientists, whether they're atheist scientists or religious scientists, the idea that that the universe is 6,000 years old, or that the universe is somewhere in the billions years old. What's interesting is, you know, there's that debate, but even though it's a debate, how I like to look at it is this person says 6,000 years old, this person says 2 billion years old. I say to hell with how old it is. It's Earth and it's existing and it's here. Let's not worry about how old it is, you know. And then another thing that I come to, and I'm actually hoping that it actually touches on it. If it doesn't, then that's totally fine. But I also was brought back to this one message that the pastor who actually used to be an atheist when he was younger was talking about how it took science long enough, but they actually did an experiment that was basically the same thing as the crucifixion. They actually did a scientific experiment where they actually not to the extent that the Bible talks about, but they basically took a cross. They took volunteers and they put them on the cross. Now they didn't nail them to them. They just held them with ropes and everything. I mean, it was just experiment. So, and what they realized was that, and I actually kind of agree with this, especially when you look at the Passion of the Christ movie, is when their legs were in that kind of crossed position and their arms were like this, it literally was keeping them upright and breathing and stuff like that. But then when Jesus died and everything, and the soldiers came to break the legs of the three men, when they got to two of the men, and it broke their legs, it was unable to keep them upright anymore, and they literally died right there because they couldn't, they couldn't fight for that breath, and it's just one of those things where, you know, I definitely, it just kind of makes you think that science and faith do have common ground, but again, it's got its limits. There's stuff that is similar and the same to both science and faith, but there's also differences, and it's okay that they have similarities and differences. But yeah, so that was chapter 3, and then I won't do it tomorrow because I have to work in the morning, but probably probably in between Sunday and Tuesday. I think I will probably read chapter 4, which is Inventing the Universe, Our Strange World. And then basically after that I have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, so I have like 5 chapters left. And then what I'm thinking is that when I'm done with this book, I think this may be the last book in a while that I think I will video on here. I may do some other videos regarding topics, or just maybe take a break from serious stuff and go to fun stuff. I don't know. I'm still kind of thinking about it, but yeah, so that's it, and I'll just end the video here. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and share, and thank you guys for watching. Rom Rom.